Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lesson 19, Part 2 now, where we're going to dive into even more detail about how to answer our, boss's question when our boss comes up and asks us to, produce that report. So now we can actually go forward and answer his question fully by making use of something that sounds confusing, but that's called control flow functions. All right, so stick with me. You're going to learn all about it in this lecture. Let's dive right into it. You might think that we're done. You might think that we've done it. We instead of, okay, I understand, instead of using the where clause, I need to use the having clause. But we still haven't answered our boss's question. Because if you remember, the boss wants to know which of the customers have a bank account balance greater than $80. So to answer this question, we'll have to get a bit more advanced with our queries because of the way our data is stored. Okay, there's no simple way to properly sum up the total right now. Okay, I don't know if you realize that, but right now, as the data stands, the reason why we can't add it up properly is that the amounts are all stored as positive numbers. So if we have a transaction, which is a credit transaction, it's stored as positive 100. But if we have a debit transaction, it's also stored as positive whatever. Okay, so we'll need a way to make certain that our amounts are negative depending on the transaction type, or rather, we need to make sure that if a transaction type is of type D, which is debit, then we need to make sure that that amount is not a positive amount but a negative amount, because that's exactly what's happening here. Whenever we make a debit transaction, we are removing money from our account. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to you, because right now, as it stands, if we were to just add up all the numbers, it would just become more and more positive, and everybody would apparently have more than $80 overall in their account. When in the real world, in actuality, that would not be the case. So we need to do something special here. So the way to explain our need in plain English is as follows. I say if a transaction is of transaction type D, then it should be a negative amount. Does that make sense? That's a very simple way to state it in English. So let's take a look at actually how we can implement this. So MySQL allows us to use control flow functions in our select statements. Okay, there's a lot of words there and a lot going on. It allows us to use something called control flow functions. If you are already familiar with programming in general, control flow could be considered like a control structure. So control structures are things like if statements, case statements, for loops, while loops, that kind of thing. It's how you control the flow of your code. Well, we have something similar in MySQL where we can control the flow of our functions, or we use a function to control the flow of our select statements, rather. So we have control flow functions, and this is how they work. Here's the generic syntax for a control flow function. That's quite a tongue twister to say that. So we have an if statement. We say if condition. Okay, here's the condition. If it is true, then we return the true condition. So rather, we return this part of the statement, the control flow function, if this condition is true. If this condition is false, then we return this part of the statement, this part of the control flow function. Okay, so if the condition is here, return the true with this part, return the false with this part. Okay, so it's a bit generic, it's a bit confusing, so let's look at exactly how we would implement this with our predicament. We can say if transaction type equals D, so if the transaction type is of type debit, so if this resolves to being true, then we return amount times -1. Okay, so what happens here is it's going to flip the amount to make it negative. Does that make sense? So again, only if the transaction type is D, it will flip the amount to be negative. However, if the transaction type is not D, if this evaluates to false, then it just returns the amount and leaves it alone. It doesn't do anything to the overall amount. Nothing is changed. Okay? So this line reads as false. If transaction type equals D, then return the amount multiplied by -1. Otherwise, just return the amount. Okay? But, big but here. Remember, this control flow function only works in tandem with a select query. Okay, because like I said up here, MySQL allows us to use control flow functions in our select statements. Okay, so if you just put this all by itself, MySQL will probably underline it in red and say you have a syntax error and probably give you a random strange error message. So how can we use it in tandem with our select statements? This is how we could do it. We can say select transaction type, comma, and then if transaction type equals D, amount minus 1, amount, blah, 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 as adjusted amount. So what we're doing here is we are essentially performing a function. We're performing some sort of operation here, and with the resulting transaction, with the resulting information, with the resulting data, we take that data, whether it's amount times minus 1 or just the amount, and we assign it an alias of adjusted amount. So I'm taking the concept of an alias right now, right here, and applying it to my control flow function, which is right here, the if statement over here. So if transaction type equals D, amount times -1, amount. All right, so it will interpret this statement and return a result, whether it's this result with the amount times -1 or this result with just amount, and it assigns it an alias of adjusted amount from the transactions table. So here's the resulting data after going through all that. Here's what it looks like. So you see here that all the credit transactions remain unchanged. Credit, 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 1, 2, 3 is still 100, blah, 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 all positive numbers. However, the debits over here are now negative, which makes sense because these are transactions that remove money from your bank account. So you see here that because we've assigned it an alias of adjusted amount, that's what it shows up as. It shows up as adjusted amount. And of course, the data appears appropriately as well. Cool? So this is some advanced stuff that we're dealing with here. Now, we're in a situation where we can truly sum up these values and determine a real balance. So I'm going to throw one more curveball at you here, and we are going to combine the three things that we just learned about. Okay? We're going to combine an aggregate function with a control flow function as well as an alias. Okay? 3 different things. Let's take a look at how that all comes together. So I know this seems like it's growing and getting crazy, but you might have to just watch this video a couple times to really get the idea of what's going on here. So now that we can get the right amounts based on the transaction type, we can sum them up. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need to actually make sure that we're appropriately looking at our amounts. So again, we have this control flow function, which is the if statement. So we say if transaction type equals D, amount times -1, amount. So if this is true, it returns -1, or amount times -1. If it's false, it returns just amount as it is in the database right now. Okay? But what we're doing is we're taking what it is that it returns, and we're performing a sum on that amount. Okay, so we're summing up the result of this control flow function. Okay, and then we're assigning the sum of that control flow function the name of total, the alias of total. Okay, so again, we've combined a bunch of different things there, and this is inside of a select statement, which is perfectly legal. We're allowed to select or put a control flow function as well as an aggregate function inside of a select statement. So this is completely valid code. All right. So when we assign the sum of the new amounts to an alias of total, here's what it is that we get in return. We use the new total in a filter and return only those with more than $80. Okay, because you see here we also have the having total is greater than $80. All right. Having is the keyword that we just learned, and that's having is used in order to combine the ability of filtering with an aggregate function. Since we're using the aggregate function called sum, because remember, sum is an aggregate function, that means that we need to use the having keyword to filter based on that function. Okay, so there's a lot of moving parts going on in this one select query, and I'm not going to say that it's not confusing, because it definitely is confusing, but again, as long as you can break these things down into the individual parts, then it becomes a lot more easier to understand, what the heck is going on here. All right. So as you can see in the resulting query, we only get 2 results. We get 2 bank accounts and we get 2 totals. Both are greater than 80. Okay, we're missing bank account 2 because I think bank account 2's total was somewhere around $50. So if we had omitted the having total greater than 80, then we would have had 3 results and the totals would have been accurate. But since we included the having total greater than 80, now it filters out that second total, which is of $50 or $57 or whatever it was. Okay, so again, all that's going on here is that we have a control flow function inside of a select statement, which is also wrapped inside of an aggregate function, which is called sum. So if, let's say we have, let's see, what would happen here? We are grouping by bank account ID, which means we're grouping by customers. We are not grouping by transaction type because here we don't want to group by transaction types because we want to sum together the 2 different types of transactions. So what we're doing is we're not grouping by them. We're only grouping by customers. And then we're taking all inside of the bucket. So if you think about, it'll create 3 different buckets for 3 different customers. It's going to take each of the transactions, put them into each of the buckets appropriately. So I believe each of the buckets will have 3 different transactions in them, if you remember correctly from our, let me go right back to when we looked at our transaction table. So we'll have 3 different transactions for each of the bank account IDs, because see, bank account ID appears once, twice, 3 times. Bank account ID 2, once, twice, 3 times. And bank account ID 3 appears once, twice, 3 times. So if we group by bank account ID, we're going to have 3 different buckets, each with 3 different transactions. Okay? And then we're going to take those transactions and we're going to say, okay, if it's a transaction type of C, leave it alone. If it's a transaction type of D, make it negative. Okay? That's what our control flow function was doing. So all of these transactions here, all these D transactions will become negatives. So we'll have 3 transactions in the first bucket. We'll have a transaction amount of 100, we'll have a transaction amount of negative 181, and we'll have a transaction amount of negative 1088. And then we're executing our sum on those totals. Okay, remember, we're not summing the amount, we're summing the new adjusted amount. So if I go forward again to here, was it here? Yes, it was. So we are assigning, although we haven't named it adjusted amount, that is what it is. That is what's happening inside of the scope of these brackets here. This will be an adjusted amount, which is the transaction type where they are equivalent to the negative ones if they are type D. So we're summing those up together. And when we sum those all up together, if I go back, it'll be 100 plus negative 181 plus negative 1088. And all those together, added up, become $87.31. Okay? And then if we go and do the same thing for bucket 2, which is bank account ID 2, we have $250.58 plus negative 515 plus negative 188, which apparently, when you add those together, add up to less than 80. So if that's correct, that actually seems a bit odd if I think about it now in my own head as I'm going over this. I wonder if my data was different inside of the resulting data set. Let me just make sure that is actually correct. So 250 minus 515 minus 188.15. Yes, it does indeed equal $57.28. Okay, didn't look like it for some reason, but there you go. It results to $57.28, which makes sense because we are filtering it out based on the having clause. So $57.28 is not bigger than 80, therefore does not appear in our final total. Okay, and then you rinse and repeat for the third bank account ID, which apparently has the biggest sum total of them all at $1,751.83. All right. Whew. So again, you'll probably have to watch this video again, maybe once or twice, to really get the idea of all this, together. Again, the main focus of this tutorial was to teach you about the having keyword, and the fact that you only have having in tandem with group by. Okay, because having, you only use a having keyword when you want to filter aggregate results, and you only have aggregate results typically when you have a group by statement. So, there you have it. That is the having keyword, as well as an advanced topic of control flow functions and how you can put them all together to get what it is that you want to be able to please your crazy bank account manager. So there you have it. Hope you liked it. Can't wait to see you in the next lesson. Bye for now.